He wasn't born into power. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria came into the world on a dry December morning in 1949 in Rio Negro, a little town in the Antioquia department of Colombia, the kind of place where time moved slower than smoke, and the sun rose with no urgency. His mother, Hermilda, was a schoolteacher, soft-spoken but stubborn. His father, Abel, was a farmer, the kind who always came home with dirt under his nails and a silence in his eyes. There was nothing rich about their lives, no golden spoons, just enough beans to eat and boots worn thin from walking. Pablo grew up watching that, men working all day, women praying all night, and dreams dying quietly in between. They moved to Medellín not long after. That city in the 1950s was a rough place. It had promise, yes, but the streets whispered things. Children played in alleys where cartels would one day butcher rivals. People sold mangoes from wooden carts near corners that would turn red with blood in years to come. No one saw it coming, not even him. But Pablo wasn't like the others. He had a stillness about him, even as a boy. He didn't talk too much, but when he did, people listened. Not because he was loud, but because he said things like he already knew what tomorrow would bring. His eyes watched everything, the way money moved, how the rich looked down on the poor, how the police only protected those who paid them. At school, he was clever, sharp with numbers. And he had a memory like a steel trap. He started small, like most who climbed too high. They say his first hustle was stealing tombstones, scraping off the names and reselling them to crooked funeral homes. Strange, yes, but it worked. It was dirty money, but it was money. After that, it was car parts, radios, cigarettes, whatever the streets could offer. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. In fact, he liked it that way. Pablo didn't smile much, but he paid attention. And what he saw was a country bleeding from its gut. Colombia in the 60s was caught between corrupt politics and rising guerrilla groups. Everyone had their hands out. The government was a joke to the poor. And to a young man like Pablo, the law wasn't something to follow. It was something to buy. Then came cocaine. It wasn't a storm at first, more like a soft wind that turned into a hurricane. Americans had started sniffing it at parties. Hollywood, Wall Street, nightclubs in New York and Miami. It became the drug of choice for the rich and restless. And like all empires, it started with demand. Pablo saw it early, saw what others missed. He didn't want to be a dealer. He wanted to be the man who supplied the dealers, the one who owned the planes, not just the product. And with every gram that crossed the border, his dream got bigger. He didn't have connections yet, but he had will. And in Colombia, back then, will could kill kings. So he started building, slowly, quietly. Men who owed him favors, cops who looked the other way, smugglers who could fly low and fast. His business was stitched together like a crooked quilt, one lie and one bullet at a time. And he didn't care how many laws he broke. He only cared how many rules he could write. By the early 70s, he had already become a name whispered in Medellín bars. Not feared yet, but respected. People said he was smart, that he paid on time, that he never made threats. But when things went wrong, bodies showed up in rivers with their eyes open. Still, to most, he was just another guy. Thick mustache, cheap shirts, a calm voice. He drove himself, ate in small restaurants, and he slept well at night, for now. But even he didn't know that one day he'd be the richest criminal in history. That one day he'd hold a whole country by the throat, and that sleep that once came easy to him would one day come only with armed guards, locked doors, and blood-stained sheets. Medellín wasn't ready for what Pablo Escobar was becoming. Not yet. By the time the 1970s rolled in, the city was changing. What used to be just small-time gangs and crooked cops was turning into something bigger, something darker. Cocaine was no longer a whisper among smugglers. It was becoming a full-scale industry. And Escobar, still in his early 20s, had already decided he wasn't going to be a customer or a mule. He was going to be the boss. But it wasn't as easy as people think. Cocaine wasn't grown in Medellín. It came from the jungles, deep, humid, and crawling with militias. The coca leaf was turned into paste, then processed into fine white powder that could vanish into water and disappear under the nose. But getting it to the United States? That was the real art. Pablo started by watching others, older men who wore gold watches and sat with their backs against the wall in restaurants. He'd sit near them and just listen. Let their pride do the talking. He learned who moved what, who paid who, which pilots could fly under radar, and which port guards could be bought with $200 and a new pair of shoes. He learned how the world really worked, not through laws, but through fear and favor. By the time he was 24, he had his own routes. The first shipment wasn't big, just a few kilos, hidden inside old car tires on a cargo ship bound for Miami. It arrived safely. The American buyers paid in full, stacks of U.S. bills rubber banded and wrapped like dirty laundry. Pablo counted every dollar by hand. Then he smiled. Not wide, not loud. Just that little smirk that said this was only the beginning. He reinvested immediately. More coke, more routes, more people. He started recruiting men from the streets of Medellín. Hungry kids, ex-convicts, men who knew how to shoot without blinking. He didn't promise them heaven, just money and loyalty. And if they gave him both, they'd rise. If they didn't, well, they didn't last long. Pablo wasn't a monster yet, not in the way history would remember, but he was sharp and sharper still when crossed. He gave orders calmly, almost like they were business memos. He'd say things like, "That man needs to be reminded." And a week later, that man's car would explode in broad daylight. The thing was, he never wanted to be flashy. Not yet. He still drove around in beat-up sedans, still visited his mother for Sunday lunch. But he was building something, and every day the foundation grew. He bought his first airplane at 25, a small Cessna, beat up on the outside, but perfect for low-altitude runs. He had it painted blue and stashed it in a hidden airstrip outside the city. That plane made him his first million. After that, the sky wasn't the limit, it was the highway. Cocaine became his religion. Not because he used it, Pablo rarely touched the stuff himself, but because he saw what it could do. In the U.S., 1 gram sold for $100. In Colombia, it cost less than $5 to make. That kind of margin was unheard of. And with each shipment, the margins grew. His men called him El Patrón, not because he demanded it, but because it just felt right. He took care of them, paid them on time, helped their families when needed. But if they stole, lied, or turned coward, he had no mercy. By the late 70s, the Medellín cartel was no longer a scattered bunch of criminals. It was an army. Pablo wasn't alone. He worked with others at first. Carlos later, the flamboyant German Colombian who loved flashy cars and hated the U.S. government. The Ochoa brothers, rich cattlemen who'd turned to drug trafficking for easy money. They called themselves businessmen, but really, they were wolves in suits. And Pablo, he was the quiet one, the thinker. He bought entire neighborhoods, built homes for the poor, sponsored football teams. He created a Robin Hood image, the man who gave to the people and stole from the empire. He walked through slums like he owned them because, in a way, he did. People cheered him, blessed him, kissed his hands. But underneath the surface, something darker was growing. The money came in too fast, bundles of dollars so thick they couldn't count them anymore. They measured by weight, 10 million in this duffel bag, 50 in that safe. Rats chewed through some of it in storage. He didn't even care. There was more coming. But with the money came enemies. The government of Colombia couldn't ignore the rising power of the cartels, nor could the Americans, whose DEA agents were starting to sniff around. At first, Pablo played it safe. He paid off local cops, mayors, even a few congressmen. But when that didn't work, he turned to fear. The policy was simple. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Most chose silver. A few chose to stand tall. None of them lasted long. There was a judge once, young, clean, full of pride. He tried to bring charges against one of Pablo's pilots. 2 weeks later, his car blew up outside the courthouse. The message was clear. There were no heroes here, only survivors. The first time Pablo ordered a killing, they say he didn't sleep for 2 days. By the 50th, he slept like a baby. Because that's the thing people don't understand. Monsters aren't born. They're built, brick by brick, one choice at a time. And Pablo made his choices with cold hands and clear eyes. He started traveling more. Miami, Panama, Nicaragua, every city had someone who owed him. He moved like a ghost. No social media, no tracking, just whispers and shadows. And back in Medellín, his empire grew teeth. He bought land outside the city, thousands of acres, built a ranch called Hacienda Nápoles. It had a private zoo, a bull ring, lakes, even a replica of the Flintstones house for his kids. It looked like paradise. But underground? That's where the real power lived. Vaults full of cash, armories stacked with weapons, cells for enemies. He started thinking bigger, not just a criminal empire, a political one. He believed, truly believed, that he could buy the government, that Colombia didn't need presidents. It needed someone who could control the chaos, and who better than the man who fed the poor, ran the streets, and paid more than half the country's police force. He ran for Congress in 1982, and he won. That's when the world noticed. A drug lord, a billionaire trafficker, sitting in the Colombian Congress, wearing suits, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. But not everyone smiled back. Luis Carlos Galán, a rising political star, stood up against him. So did Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice. These men had courage, but they didn't understand who they were fighting, not fully. Pablo wasn't a gangster anymore. He was a machine, and when machines get threatened, they crush. In 1984, Lara was gunned down in Bogota. Broad daylight, no warning, just bullets and screams. Galán, too, would later be assassinated. Pablo wasn't hiding who he was anymore. He had declared war on the state. And yet, through all this, he still came home. He'd sit with his mother, eat arepas and drink coffee like nothing had changed. His son, Juan Pablo, remembers him as kind, gentle, never shouting, just calm. But calm isn't peace. And Pablo hadn't known peace in years. Every night he slept with a gun under his pillow. Even in mansions, even with guards outside, he never let his guard down. He had learned that money protects no one, fear does. He'd lay his head on silk sheets, knowing that someone, somewhere, was planning his death. Rival cartels, police, politicians, even his own men. Trust became poison. He once said, "Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States." And he meant it. That's the story so far. From tombstone hustler to billionaire drug king, Pablo Escobar's rise wasn't fast. It was methodical, like a python wrapping tighter every year. He hadn't just built an empire, he'd become the system. And for now, Colombia belonged to him. But nothing built on blood lasts forever, not even Pablo. Medellín had changed. And it wasn't just the buildings, it was the silence. The kind that settles over a city that knows it's being watched. The kind of silence you feel before a storm or before a gunshot. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar didn't just rule the cocaine trade, he ruled the streets. The police didn't chase him, they protected him. Judges shredded his files. Congressmen bowed their heads when he passed. Mayors made backroom deals. And the poor, they treated him like a savior. But the illusion of control, it never lasts forever. There was a thin crack in Pablo's empire, and it came from a place he didn't expect, the United States. While Colombia played the game of silver or lead, the Americans didn't take bribes, or at least not the right ones. And what scared Pablo more than death itself was one simple word: extradition. That word became a noose around his neck. The Colombian government had signed an agreement with the U.S. Any citizen accused of serious crimes could be sent across the border and tried in American courts. Over there, he couldn't buy judges, he couldn't threaten juries, and the jails weren't like the ones back home. If Pablo ever ended up in an American prison, he knew one thing: he'd die in a cage. So he fought it, with everything. He lobbied against the extradition treaty. Publicly, he talked about sovereignty, patriotism, dignity. Privately, he started killing anyone who supported it. Policemen, politicians, journalists. Their names didn't matter, only their positions. And the blood, it didn't stop flowing. There was a time, around 1985, when bombs became normal, in malls, in cars, in courtrooms, even in schools. Medellín turned into a city on edge. People walked with their heads low. Mothers didn't let their children out after dark. And every morning, the radio would list the dead, like reading a grocery list, casual, heartless, necessary. But through it all, Pablo never flinched. He'd sit in Hacienda Nápoles, feeding his exotic animals while the country burned. He'd host soccer tournaments and laugh with friends while people died for his cause. And in his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the man protecting his homeland from foreign chains. And somehow, to the poor, that made sense. You have to understand, Colombia was already bleeding. The rich had always robbed the poor. The government had always been corrupt. So when Pablo Escobar built housing for slum families, paid for surgeries, bought textbooks for schools, and gave out food, he became a god to the forgotten. They didn't see the bombs, they saw the bread. They didn't hear the screams, they heard the promises. And so, while the elite called him a terrorist, the barrios called him El Patrón del Pueblo, the people's boss. But even gods can be hunted. The DEA had started to close in. American agents wearing shirts soaked in sweat, boots coated in Colombian dirt, began working alongside local forces who couldn't always be trusted. They'd raid one house, and the next day that same house would be empty, cleaned out, as if someone had tipped them off. And someone always had. That's how deep Pablo's reach was. He had eyes everywhere, in the airport, in the army, even in the intelligence services. He knew their moves before they made them. Sometimes he let them get close, just to remind them who they were dealing with. But there were mistakes. One in particular changed everything. It was a boy, 15, poor, skinny, eyes too old for his face. He'd been paid to carry a bomb into a federal building, told it would be easy. Drop the bag, walk out, disappear. But something went wrong. The timing, the wiring, nobody knows. The building exploded with the boy still inside. His body was blown into pieces. But his mother spoke to the press, tears, shaking hands, holding a picture of her son in front of flashing cameras. She said, "He was promised a future. They gave him death." And that moment, captured on national TV, started to crack Pablo's illusion. People still feared him, still took his money. But the whisper changed. It wasn't, "He helps us." It became, "He uses us." Pablo noticed it too. He began trusting less, moving less. Paranoia settled in his bones like winter cold. He slept in different houses each night, never told his wife where he was going. His most loyal men began disappearing, some arrested, some killed, some vanishing without a word. He stopped appearing in public altogether. The man who once shook hands with congressmen now hid in the shadows of his own empire. And then came the turning point, the Avianca Flight 203 bombing, 1989, Bogotá. A commercial flight carrying 107 passengers exploded mid-air. The plane disintegrated above the Colombian countryside, raining fire and bodies. There were no survivors. Pablo hadn't meant to kill everyone. He'd only meant to kill one man, a presidential candidate named Cesar Gaviria. But Gaviria wasn't even on the plane. Only families, tourists, children. The horror was impossible to spin. Even the barrios fell silent. There were no cheers, no blessings, just fear. For the first time, Pablo had gone too far. The government declared all-out war, not just police raids, not just speeches, but tanks in the streets, helicopters in the skies, soldiers with orders to kill. The bounty on Pablo's head grew to millions. His allies were arrested or gunned down. His houses were raided one by one. Safe houses became graves. But he didn't fall. He adapted. He moved deeper underground, changed his appearance, cut off communication lines. He paid double to anyone who stayed loyal and tortured those who didn't. Medellín became a battlefield, the city of eternal spring now soaked in blood and tension. And in the middle of it all, Pablo still held one card no one expected. he offered to surrender, but on his terms. That's when the world heard about La Catedral, a prison, but not really. More like a fortress built by a king for himself, perched on a mountain overlooking the city. High walls, yes, but also a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall. Phones, TVs, girls, visitors, everything. The guards, all handpicked by Pablo. The government agreed. They were desperate. They needed peace. So they accepted his surrender. And in June of 1991, Pablo Escobar walked into his own prison like Caesar returning home. He smiled for the cameras, calm, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed shirt. He said he was ready to turn a new page, that he believed in God, in country, in peace. And for a brief moment, it seemed like it might actually work. The violence slowed. The bodies stopped stacking up. Colombians exhaled. But peace with a man like Pablo, it was just another lie. Inside La Catedral, he ran his empire like before, gave orders, approved hits, counted money. He even tortured and killed 2 of his own men within the prison walls. Their screams were heard by guards, but no one moved. No one dared. Eventually, the government realized the truth. They'd handed Colombia to the devil in exchange for quiet. So they tried to move him, a proper prison this time, real bars, real guards. But Pablo was ready. He escaped before they arrived, vanished into the hills like smoke into night. And now, the hunt began again. Only this time, it wasn't just the government chasing him. A new group had formed. Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Backed by rival cartels, rogue cops, and whispers of CIA support, they went after anyone connected to him. Lawyer, dead. Accountant, dead. Cousin, bombed. Entire families vanished in the dark. Pablo watched his empire collapse one piece at a time. He couldn't trust anyone. He moved constantly, hid in basements, sewers, behind fake walls, ate cold food, slept in clothes. And yet, he never gave up. Not once. Because for Pablo Escobar, this wasn't just survival. It was war, and war was all he knew. He never thought it would end like this. Not in hiding, not with greasy food, a plastic mattress, and a radio whispering the names of his dead friends. Pablo Escobar had once owned entire cities. Judges, airstrips, presidents, priests, they all bent to his power. Now, in the final days of 1993, he was sleeping on floors and listening for footsteps that might be the last he ever heard. He was still rich. Technically, still had millions stashed across Colombia, buried in fields, sealed in walls, locked in safe houses. But money no longer meant safety. Not when every man who ever took a peso from him now saw a price on his head. The old loyalty was gone, replaced by fear. And fear, as Pablo once taught others, is never permanent. It fades when the gun shifts direction. He trusted almost no one now, just a few men, 2 or 3. Old guards, ghosts from the beginning, men who had killed with him when it was about survival, not empire. They rotated hideouts every 2 or 3 days. One night, a farmhouse. Next, an attic. Then a safe room beneath a mechanic's shop. Every move was planned, but the cracks were widening. He couldn't see his wife, his children. The phones were tapped. Every call was a risk. Still, sometimes he couldn't help himself. He needed to hear his son's voice, just to remember why he kept running. Juan Pablo was a teenager now, old enough to understand what his father had done, old enough to ask real questions. Why did you kill so many, Papa? Did you ever regret it? Pablo had no answers, not honest ones, so he avoided the truth, told his boy to study hard, to be better than him, to never trust the government, to never trust anyone, to survive. His health was failing too. He'd gained weight, a lot. His face looked swollen, his hair greasy. He had high blood pressure, chest pains, insomnia. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of a gunshot from a decade ago. Sometimes he saw the faces of men he ordered killed. Some deserved it, others, maybe not. He wasn't haunted by their deaths, not really. He was haunted by the loss of control, because Pablo wasn't a sadist. He wasn't a psychopath. He was something worse, a believer. He truly believed he could be the one who rewrote the rules, that Colombia could be his, that the blood spilled would be worth it in the end. But now, sitting in a darkened room with a bag of stale bread and a pistol under his pillow, he wasn't a boss anymore. He was just a man being hunted. The government wanted him dead. So did the DEA, the CIA, the rival Cali Cartel, Los Pepes, that hybrid death squad of former friends, traitors, and ex-cops. They especially wanted him gone, not arrested, not captured, dead. They'd already killed dozens of his allies, bombed houses where his cousins were sleeping, shot his lawyers in the street, put heads on stakes. This wasn't justice, it was a warning. One by one, his empire turned into tombstones. He started talking to God more, not because he was spiritual, but because in silence, even killers need someone to blame. He still read newspapers, watched the world move on. Kids dancing in soap commercials, politicians shaking hands on stage, Miss Colombia crowned on live TV. None of it made sense. He had bled for this country. He had bought peace with violence. He had built roads where no one else would, fed mouths that the government ignored. And now they acted like he was the disease. Maybe he was, but that realization didn't come with shame, just acceptance. His inner circle had shrunk to almost nothing. Blackie, Lemon, a few others. These men knew the risk. They weren't fighting for power anymore, just survival. Some had families, some didn't. Most were tired of the running, the hiding, the shadows, and tired of watching a man they once saw as a god slowly rot from the inside out. They never told him that, of course, but Pablo could feel it. There was a heaviness in the air now, the way they looked at him, respectful but distant, like they were already preparing for life after him. He couldn't blame them. He'd betrayed people too, killed for less. And now, the walls were closing in. They had tried to move him 2 days earlier. The location had been compromised, again. A friend of a friend had ratted. DEA had moved in, but missed him by minutes. Escobar had slipped out the back door, barefoot, holding his radio in one hand and his pistol in the other. He'd walked for hours through muddy hills, silent, wet, and wheezing. He almost gave up that night, almost told Lehman to stop, to let it end. But pride wouldn't allow it. He didn't want to die tired. He wanted to die as El Patrón. And yet, he wasn't El Patrón anymore. He was Pablo, middle-aged, sick, cornered, paranoid, lonely. He paced small rooms in circles, ate cold food from cans, hid when headlights passed, listened to the static of radios more than the voices of his loved ones. Every knock on the door made him reach for his gun. Every sound in the alley turned his stomach cold. That night, he called his son again, despite every warning. It was his birthday, December 1st, 1993. Pablo Escobar turned 44. His son answered. The line was weak, tapped. But Pablo didn't care. He just wanted to hear him say, "Happy birthday, Papa." They spoke for 6 minutes, maybe 7. Enough time for the search block, the special police task force hunting him, to triangulate the call. They locked on the signal, sent word to a local unit, closed in on the house. Pablo was smiling when the call ended, one of the few real smiles he'd shown in weeks. He sat by the window, radio in hand, humming a song from his childhood. He had no idea that his hunters were already in the stairwell. He heard a sound, just a slight echo on the roof tiles above. Could have been a cat, could have been the wind, but something in him knew. He stood quickly, grabbed his gun, yelled for Lemon to check the back. They didn't argue. They'd done this drill 100 times. He moved to the bathroom window, lifted the curtain slowly, gun pointed, sweat already dripping. Then came the first crack of a rifle. Window glass shattered, wood exploded. Pablo ducked, rolled, returned fire. He didn't scream, didn't panic, just acted, like a man who'd trained for this moment his whole life. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. The front door burst open. Lemon went down first, shot in the chest. Blood hit the wall like paint. Pablo ran, up, always up. He knew it was a mistake, but his body did what instinct told it to. He reached the roof, flat, open, no cover. Bullets tore through the sky. He fired back blindly. Then one hit his leg. He fell, cursed, crawled to the edge, heard boots behind him, felt the end creeping closer. Another shot hit him, near the shoulder. Blood soaked his shirt. He gasped, eyes wide. He didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't pray. He turned the gun toward himself, or maybe someone else fired. No one's sure. But the bullet entered behind the ear, just like he always said he'd do. Because to Pablo, prison was never an option, only freedom or death. And just like that, it was over. December the 2nd, 1993. Pablo Escobar lay on a dirty rooftop in Medellín, bleeding out, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. The search block stood over him like hunters over a trophy. Cameras clicked, radios buzzed, someone made a joke, someone else whispered a prayer. But no one touched him for a while. Because even dead, he still felt dangerous. The news broke an hour later. The drug lord was dead. The man who had once earned $400 million a week. The man who built his own prison, who blew up planes, ordered the deaths of politicians, bought entire governments. Gone. Some celebrated, others cried, and in the barrios he once fed, candles were lit, not for justice, not for peace, but for the ghost of a man who gave them bread when no one else did. The king was dead. But the war wasn't over. When Pablo Escobar bled out on that Medellín rooftop, a bullet behind his ear and his empire in ruins, the streets didn't suddenly go quiet. There was no peace treaty, no nationwide sigh of relief. Instead, Colombia held its breath, because even without Pablo, the storm hadn't passed. If anything, it was just beginning to change direction. His body was still warm when the news started to spread. Radios buzzed. TV anchors in Bogotá tried to keep their voices steady. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, leader of the Medellín Cartel, has been shot and killed in a confrontation with the Colombian National Police. They said it like it was final. But nothing about Pablo's story was ever clean. In Medellín, the people who once called him El Patrón del Pueblo gathered outside his mother's house. Some cried, others stood in silence. A few crossed themselves as if Pablo had been a saint, not the man who'd ordered hundreds of killings. Women wept openly. Old men whispered stories. Children too young to understand stood by their parents, looking up at photos of the man who had built their neighborhood, their soccer field, their hospital. To them, he wasn't a drug lord. He was the man who gave them dignity when the government wouldn't even give them water. At his funeral, more than 25,000 people showed up. They flooded the cemetery, packed the streets, climbing trees, walls, even rooftops, just to see the box that held what was left of him. Some carried signs. Others carried flowers. A few carried guns tucked in belts or hidden in jackets, just in case. It rained that day, not hard, just enough to turn the air thick, enough to make it feel like the sky had come down to watch. But not everyone mourned. Far from it. In the high offices of Bogotá, men drank quietly. In Miami, DEA agents made phone calls with tired voices and cold eyes. In Cali, rival drug lords raised their glasses and toasted the fall of the monster they once feared. They didn't cry for Pablo, they smiled. Because they understood what many others didn't. Pablo's death wasn't the end of the drug war. It was just a shift in power. And with the Medellín cartel collapsing, there was room for new kings. The first to move were the Cali cartel. Smarter, cleaner, more politically connected. They didn't bomb buildings or shoot judges in the streets. They worked like shadows, greasing the right hands, making the right deals. Where Pablo was a lion, they were snakes, silent, poisonous, and patient. And now they wanted everything. Pablo's roots, his labs, his stash houses, his corrupt officials, even his soldiers, the few that survived and hadn't fled into hiding. Some joined the Cali ranks immediately. Others tried to go independent. Most of those were dead within weeks. Because once Escobar fell, everyone turned on each other. Blackie was captured. Popeye surrendered. Some of the Ochoa brothers were already in jail. And Los Pepes. They didn't disband. They transformed. From a death squad into something more organized, more politically useful. Some say many of them were absorbed into Colombia's security forces, legitimized with badges and ranks. Others disappeared, but not before they'd executed dozens of Escobar loyalists, burned farms, bombed homes, and left behind a trail of fear no different from what Pablo had created. One monster replaced another. That's how Colombia worked back then. Inside Pablo's own family, the cracks widened. His widow, Maria Victoria, was now a hunted woman, not by the police, but by rivals who wanted to make sure nothing was left of Escobar's legacy. She moved quietly, often in the middle of the night, always with her children. She reached out to the Colombian government, asked for safe passage out of the country, asked for protection. They gave it, reluctantly, because a dead man's wife didn't matter much politically. But if she was killed, that could start the cycle again. Eventually, they fled to Argentina, changed their names, started over, but Pablo's shadow followed them everywhere. As for his mother, Hermilda, she never apologized for him, never admitted he was wrong. To her, Pablo was a good son, a smart boy who got caught up in the wrong business. In her eyes, he didn't fail the world. The world failed him. She kept his photos up, kept his name alive, defended him on talk shows. She saw the children he fed, not the men he killed. She saw the homes he built, not the car bombs he ordered. Maybe that was her way of surviving. Or maybe she just couldn't let go of the boy she raised in the hills of Antioquia. Hacienda Nápoles was seized by the government. What was once a drug lord's private paradise, with its zoo, helipads, lakes, and sculptures, became an abandoned ghost land. Looters came first, then photographers, then journalists. They found strange things in the vaults, stacks of rotting cash, torture chambers, recordings, fake passports, guns wrapped in plastic. One room held only Polaroid pictures, hundreds of them, faces smiling beside Escobar, many of whom would die by his hand later. Time turned the property into a public park, a kind of amusement park. For years you could visit it, take a tour, ride horses where soldiers once died. That's how Colombia deals with trauma sometimes. It builds fences around it and charges admission. But the real chaos wasn't in the jungles. It was in Medellín. Because Pablo's death left a hole, and every gang in the city wanted to fill it, the vacuum gave rise to a new generation of criminals, smaller, more chaotic, less disciplined. They didn't care about loyalty or politics. They didn't call themselves kings. They were wolves, and the city became their feeding ground. Kidnappings rose, robberies spiked, entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds again. Police couldn't control it, no one could, because when a man like Pablo dies, he doesn't take his sins with him, he leaves them behind. And the people have to live in the ashes. For the politicians, Escobar's death became a symbol. They painted it as a victory for law and order, for justice. They claimed the system worked. But the truth? It had been blood and betrayal that brought him down, not law, not reform. And once he was gone, nothing changed for the poor. The barrios he helped were left to rot again. The kids he fed went back to stealing. The women he protected went back to fearing the streets at night. The hospitals he built ran out of medicine because Pablo's money stopped flowing and the government never cared enough to replace it. In time, people stopped saying his name, not out of respect, but out of exhaustion. Everyone had a story. An uncle killed, a house raided, a cousin who worked for the cartel, a family member buried in silence. It was too much, too messy, too painful. And so, silence became the only peace they could afford. But Pablo Escobar's story didn't end in that grave. Not really. Books came, then documentaries, then TV shows, movies, songs, cartoons, podcasts. Some made him a villain. Others made him a hero. Most just made him a product. His life was picked apart, sold, repackaged. He became more famous dead than alive. Tourists visit Medellín now, asking for Pablo tours. They wear t-shirts with his face on them. They drink cocktails named after him. They take selfies in front of the place where he died. And every time they do, Colombia bleeds a little more. Because behind the legend was a truth no one likes to face. Pablo Escobar didn't break Colombia. He was a symptom of it. A country where power comes from fear. Where the poor are used, not served. Where the government sells promises and cartels sell results. And when you leave people like that for long enough, Someone like Pablo always rises. He always knew he would die young. That wasn't fear talking, that was certainty. Even in his early 20s, when he was just beginning to move cocaine across borders, Pablo Escobar never imagined an old age, not for himself, not for men like him. He might have told others he wanted to live in peace on a farm, to retire one day, raise horses, watch his kids grow. But in private, in those rare quiet moments between chaos and calculation, he knew the truth. Some men are built for fire, not for sunsets. He didn't show fear the way ordinary people do. He didn't flinch at the mention of death, didn't back down from threats, not because he was brave, but because death, to him, was a currency, one he traded daily, one he dealt in more than dollars or kilos. He decided when others died. That power changed how he viewed his own mortality. It wasn't something to avoid. It was something to manage. He once told a priest, during one of the rare times he attended confession, "I know I'm going to hell, Father. I just hope they let me run it." It was a joke, but the priest didn't laugh, because you could feel it in Pablo's voice. He wasn't bluffing. From early on, he was obsessed with control of people, of money, of outcomes, and above all, of perception. He hated the idea of being seen as weak. He hated uncertainty. He hated surprise. Every deal, every move, every hit, it had to be measured, planned, precise. If chaos entered the picture, he didn't run from it. He simply brought more chaos until he was the one steering the storm. But the one thing he couldn't control, the one thing that clawed at the edges of his mind, was death. Not his enemies, his own. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, armored cars, safe houses, secret tunnels. He carried pistols everywhere, slept with a rifle beside his bed. His windows were bulletproof. His phone lines constantly rotated. He'd even trained himself to sleep with one ear open, trained his senses to detect movement at night, trained his mind to stay sharp through exhaustion. But he knew it was all temporary. He was preparing for war, not retirement. There was a code he repeated often, to his men, to himself, to anyone who would listen. It's better to have a grave in Colombia than a prison in the United States. He didn't say it for effect. He lived by it. In his mind, there were only two outcomes to the life he chose: victory or death. There was no in-between. No surrender, no negotiated peace. Every compromise felt like a form of dying anyway. People think power corrupts slowly, like a slow leak of poison. But in Pablo's case, it was rapid. Once the first million came in, once the first judge bowed, once the first cop called him Señor Escobar with respect in his voice, he stopped seeing the world the way ordinary men did. He became a god in his own eyes, and gods don't die quietly. Yet despite all his bravado, he had rituals, quiet, personal, strange ones. He kept a list of names, people he feared, people he watched, people he suspected would one day betray him. No one ever saw the list. But it existed, hidden somewhere in Hacienda Nápoles, in one of the safes beneath the marble floors. He'd revisit it often, cross names off, add new ones. The list wasn't long, but it always ended with one word: me. Because he didn't trust anyone, not even himself. He feared betrayal more than bullets. Betrayal came from people who smiled, who hugged, who called him brother. And that's what gnawed at him the most. He couldn't ever fully relax, even among his own blood. That paranoia became part of his DNA. It shaped the way he loved, the way he parented, the way he ruled. His wife noticed it first. At family dinners, he'd sometimes sit in silence, scanning faces, not angry, not distracted, just calculating. You could see it in his eyes, that flicker of thought, that tightening of the jaw. That mental chessboard playing out moves 5 steps ahead. She once asked him, "Do you even trust me?" He didn't answer. He just changed the subject. The only place he seemed to find any peace was around his children. When Juan Pablo was born, something cracked open in him, not softened. Escobar never softened, but deepened. The boy became a tether to something pure, untouched. When they were together, Pablo would kneel down. Let the child climb on his shoulders, tell him stories, whisper dreams. He once promised him a world where they could fish in a river with no bodyguards, no phones, no fear. But he never built that world, only the opposite. And when Juan Pablo got older, he saw it. He saw the blood on his father's boots. He heard the gunshots. He felt the weight of a name that made half the country cheer and the other half hide. Pablo tried to shield him, but children see what they're not supposed to. At night, when the boys slept, Pablo would sometimes sit outside on the balcony, a cigar in one hand, a pistol in the other. He'd stare at the stars like a man waiting for a message. One of his men, Limon, once asked, "What do you think about when you look up there, Patrón?" Pablo answered without turning his head, "How small I really am, and how big I made my problems." It was the closest thing to an admission he ever gave. He knew people would come for him, knew the DEA was watching, knew the Cali cartel wanted him dead. Knew Los Pepes were hunting his family. He even suspected that some of his own inner circle were feeding information to the enemy, not out of hate, but out of survival. He accepted it, but he didn't forgive it. Forgiveness was a luxury he didn't believe in, not in his world. Every betrayal had to be punished, not for justice, but for the message. That's why he never let go of grudges, never truly forgave. Every slight, every betrayal, every disrespect, it lived inside him like a parasite, feeding him, driving him, keeping him sharp. And in that way, his anger kept him alive. But slowly, the walls closed in. And as they did, his relationship with death began to change. It was no longer distant. It wasn't theoretical. It was personal now. He stopped eating well, gained weight, slept less, grew irritable. His body aged faster than it should have. His mind never shut off. He knew it was coming, and not in a blaze of glory like the movies. Not in some grand shootout with cameras and last words. He'd die in a hallway, or a bathroom, or a rooftop, sweating, out of breath, alone. And somehow, that was worse. He once visited a graveyard in the middle of the night. Just him and Limon. No guards, no speeches, just silence. He walked between tombstones, smoking, running his fingers over the names of men long forgotten. Limon asked him what he was looking for. Pablo said, "A place that feels like me. Not too pretty, not too clean, just quiet." Later, when he was buried, it wasn't that kind of place. His grave was swarmed, photographed, touched, cried over, vandalized, worshipped, spat on. He became more famous in death than he ever was in life. And still, it wasn't enough. Because the truth is, he didn't want to be remembered. Not really. He wanted to be feared forever. He wanted the next generations of criminals to mention his name like a warning. He wanted presidents to sleep poorly at night, wondering if their security was good enough. He wanted the poor to whisper his stories to their children as both inspiration and threat. But the world moves on, even from legends. Now he's a brand, a Netflix character, a name printed on t-shirts, a cautionary tale used in political campaigns, a ghost. And ghosts don't scare the living forever. But before all that, before the fall, before the rooftop, Pablo once said something to Juan Pablo, a line that the boy remembered long after his father's body went cold. The only thing more dangerous than power is losing it. And Pablo knew he was losing it every day. Every time a safe house was raided, every time another lieutenant flipped, every time his son asked him, "Why are we running?" He knew, and knowing that didn't make him change. It just made him angrier, more desperate, more deadly. So he walked willingly into the trap. The final calls, the final safe house, the final rooftop. He could have surrendered. He could have tried to vanish, taken a fake passport, escaped to the jungle, started again. But that wasn't who he was. He was Pablo Escobar, the man who blew up planes, who built his own prison, who bought presidents and butchered enemies, who gave candy to slum kids and bombs to assassins, the man who thought he could bend the world to his will, and for a time, he did. But not forever. Nothing is forever. They buried his body in Jardins Montesacro, a cemetery on the outskirts of Medellín. but his shadow never stayed in the ground. Not really. Pablo Escobar was dead, officially. Autopsied, photographed, buried, and filed away. But the idea of Pablo, that never died. In fact, it grew. Bigger, louder, meaner. It started small. A few kids spray-painted his name on the walls of Medellin's poorer barrios. In neighborhoods he'd once funded, they painted Gracias, Patrón, a strange sort of grief. The kind of mourning that didn't ask whether the man was good or bad, only that he was the only one who ever gave a damn. But not everyone mourned. To the families who lost children in his bombings, he was a demon. To those who watched their sons disappear into his ranks, only to come back in boxes, he was nothing but a butcher. To journalists forced into hiding, to judges living behind armored doors, to mayors who buried colleagues, Escobar's death was not enough. Justice hadn't come. Only a body, and bodies don't repair broken countries. After Pablo's death, Colombia wanted to move on, or at least pretend it could. The president gave speeches, promised a new future, cleaner politics, stronger justice, investment in the barrios, peace. But speeches don't silence the past. The Medellín cartel fell, but the system Pablo built stayed intact. The guns, the cash, the networks, they were simply absorbed by others. The Cali cartel rose almost overnight, and when they fell, the Norte del Valle cartel stepped up, and when they were dismantled, Mexico took the wheel. Pablo's empire didn't die, it multiplied. Colombia became a country with two faces. In one face, the streets were paved, the malls modernized, the global companies arrived, and foreign investors smiled. Medellín was reborn as a tourist city. Hip bars, cable cars, innovation awards, a city of transformation. But the other face, it never changed. The barrios still lived in fear. Gangs still ruled entire blocks. Police still disappeared people. Politicians still took money under the table. The slums that Pablo once used as a stage remained poor, underfunded, and dangerous. The paint got brighter, but the bones underneath were the same. The world, meanwhile, discovered Escobar's story like it was a gold mine. Filmmakers came first, then authors, then TV producers, then actors with slicked-back hair and bad Spanish accents. Suddenly, Escobar was everywhere, on screens, on shirts, in rap lyrics, in tourist brochures. In Miami, you could order a drink called the Medellín Mule. In Spain, clubs played reggaeton songs glorifying his name. In Netflix boardrooms, they greenlit season after season of drug lord dramas. Pablo became a genre and a brand. It disgusted some Colombians. To them, this was no entertainment. It was trauma. It was funerals. It was hiding under beds while bombs shook the windows. It was silence at dinner, because the wrong words could get you killed. It was cousins you never saw again. It was phones that never rang after certain days. To watch foreigners glamorize the man who terrorized your family felt like a slap in the face. But that's what the world does. It turns monsters into merchandise. Even Hacienda Nápoles, once the stronghold of a narco king, became a theme park. The government seized it, bulldozed the weapons caches, tore down the drug labs. Then they repainted the place, installed water slides, built animal exhibits, added fake dinosaurs for the kids. You could ride go-karts where hitmen used to train. You could picnic next to the private zoo where Escobar kept his hippos. Yes, the hippos survived. He imported 4 of them in the 1980s, 2 males, 2 females. Left behind, they bred out of control. Now there are dozens roaming the rivers of Antioquia, untouchable, protected, wild. Pablo's only living legacy, monstrous. Out of place and impossible to get rid of. But the biggest scar Pablo left behind wasn't the hippos or the TV shows or the grave with flowers from strangers. It was a template. He taught a generation that crime wasn't just profitable, it was political. It could buy power, build loyalty, shape a country. He showed them that with enough money and violence, you didn't need a vote to rule. And young men across Latin America and even beyond took that lesson to heart. In Mexico, cartel bosses started copying his methods. In Brazil, gang leaders used his community tactics. In Africa, warlords adopted his blend of charity and terror. Escobar wasn't just a criminal, he was a blueprint. And yet, for all that, the people closest to him tried to erase the name. His wife changed her identity, moved to Argentina, tried to live a quiet life. But the past caught up. Argentine authorities discovered who she really was. Bank accounts were frozen, interviews were demanded. Old questions reopened. His son, Juan Pablo, now Sebastian Marroquin, went a different route. He chose to confront the legacy. He wrote a book, gave speeches, visited the children of his father's victims, apologized publicly again and again, not for Pablo's choices, but for the silence that followed them. He said, "My father didn't leave us millions. He left us pain, a name soaked in blood, and a country that still whispers when they say it." But despite it all, Pablo remains unforgettable. His face is still printed on lighters sold at airport kiosks. His name still gets clicks, views, streams. Every few years, a new show gets made. A new actor steps into his shoes. A new wave of people learn about the man who ruled Colombia like a king and died like a rat on a rooftop. And people ask, why him? Why does he still matter? Why, after all the horror, do people still care? The answer is simple. Because he embodied something ugly that still lives in the world. That belief that power is the only truth, that fear can build loyalty, that money can erase sin, that rules are for the poor. And until those ideas die, Pablo Escobar never really will. In the neighborhoods where he once walked, people still tell stories. They say he once paid for every child in the barrio to get new shoes. They say he personally carried sacks of cement to help build a church. They say he gave money to widows who couldn't bury their dead. And they say these things next to the homes where his sicarios murdered fathers in front of their kids. That contradiction lives side by side, in whispers, in memories, in the way trauma works, not in straight lines, but in spirals. Colombia has tried to heal. There are schools now where there were none, libraries where once there were bullets, police forces better trained, less corrupt, not perfect but improved. There are murals that honor victims now. Tributes to the journalists who refused to stay silent, memorials for the bombings, names of the dead written in stone so they won't vanish in time. And yet, every so often, a new generation rediscovers Pablo. Not as a warning, but as a symbol of defiance. That's what makes him so dangerous still, not the body, the idea. Because deep down, the conditions that created him, they still exist. Poverty, corruption, neglect, power vacuums. The same forces that let a young man from Antioquia rise from stealing gravestones to owning countries are still here, waiting for the next Pablo. Different name, different flag, different continent maybe, but same soul. And so the story doesn't end at his grave. It spreads, in whispers through prisons, in songs on the radio, in TV screens across the globe, in boys dreaming of fast money and louder names, in governments that still sell silence, in cities where the poor still wait for someone to feed them. Pablo Escobar's story is over, but his legacy is not. Before the guns, before the name became legend, Pablo was just a boy, a thin, sharp-eyed kid with scuffed shoes, dirt under his nails, and a silence that wasn't shy. It was watching, calculating. He wasn't poor the way people like to romanticize it. There were no starving bellies or barefoot walks through deserts. No. His poverty was the common kind, the kind most Colombians knew too well. Shoes with holes, secondhand clothes, rice without meat, and bills that came faster than prayers could reach God. His father, Abel, was a quiet man, a farmer with rough hands and a rougher voice. The kind of father who didn't explain much. He worked the land, worked it hard, and came home tired. There were days when he barely said 10 words, days when silence filled the house like fog. Pablo didn't love him. He respected him, maybe, but love was too tender for what they had. His mother, Hermilda, was the opposite, sharp-tongued, educated, driven, a schoolteacher with dreams she kept locked behind her teeth. She wanted more for her children, especially Pablo. She saw in him something different, not just cleverness, not just ambition, but rage, not the loud kind, the slow-burning kind, that quiet anger at being born forgotten. He hated being poor. Even as a child, he understood what it meant to be looked down on. He saw how the rich walked differently, how they spoke with cleaner words, how the police treated them with respect, while treating the rest like trash with lungs. And something in Pablo decided early on. I won't be poor forever. I'd rather burn the world than stay small in it. School bored him. He wasn't a fool. He was smart, disturbingly smart, but the rules didn't fit him. He memorized what he had to, copied what he couldn't fake, and skipped the rest. Teachers saw potential in him, but they also saw defiance. Pablo never asked questions to learn. He asked to expose weakness. By the time he was a teenager, he had two reputations: the boy with answers, and the boy with a knife. He didn't fight often, didn't have to. One fight, maybe two, but enough for people to realize he didn't bluff, he didn't shout. If pushed, he'd act, cold, immediate, the kind of boy you don't corner. He made money however he could. First, it was selling cigarettes, single sticks. He'd buy cheap packs from wholesalers and stand near bus stops, flipping them for coins. Then it was fake lottery tickets. Then stolen electronics, car stereos, tires. Once, he even sold fake diplomas to university students too lazy to earn them. Made a killing off that. But the one that stuck, the hustle people still whisper about, was the tombstones. Yes, gravestones. He and a friend would sneak into cemeteries at night, pry up old marble plaques, sand off the names, and resell them to corrupt funeral homes. It was risky, blasphemous even. But it worked. The dead don't talk, and the poor don't ask questions when it's cheap. That was his education, not school, the street. And Medellín in the 1960s was a school of shadows, a city on the edge, growing, industrializing, modernizing, but bleeding too. The rich lived in the hills, the poor in the dust and heat of the valley. Violence wasn't everywhere, but it lurked close. Everyone knew someone who'd vanished. The air felt tight. Opportunity was limited. But if you were bold enough, ruthless enough, you could carve your own ladder. Pablo met men who showed him how. Not teachers, not priests, not politicians, criminals, men who smuggled cigarettes across borders, men who bribed cops with fresh-cut cash, men who wore gold watches with blood still drying under their fingernails. They didn't preach, they just existed. And Pablo watched them the way wolves study lions, with envy and ambition. They were respected, protected. They weren't rich like the businessmen, but they were untouchable. The cops feared them. The poor admired them. The women leaned closer when they spoke, and Escobar saw all that and thought, that's how you survive. Not by obeying, by becoming the man people obey. In his late teens, he leveled up. The money got better, the crimes got bigger, cars started showing up with different plates. He bought his first gun, not to use, just to carry. He liked the weight of it, the idea that it gave him options. By 20, he was running small crews, moving packages, not drugs, not yet, but contraband, electronics, booze, cigarettes. He learned routes, customs loopholes, the bribe amounts for different officials. He built a network, paid well, paid on time, never talked more than he had to. He was building reputation, and in Medellín, that was more valuable than gold. He fell in love once. Her name was Marta. Pretty, sharp, from a working-class family. She liked that he was confident but not arrogant, that he listened when others didn't. They dated quietly, went on walks, shared plans. He told her he wanted to own land one day, be a cattleman, maybe politics if the country didn't fall apart. But Marta saw the change before it finished forming. She saw the anger he tried to bury, the nights he came home late, smelling like oil and smoke. The money he couldn't explain, the friends who looked like soldiers without uniforms. She asked him, "Are you going to end up in jail, Pablo?" He didn't answer. She left. It didn't break him. Nothing ever really did. If he felt anything, he buried it. And more work, more money, more deals. He started using violence strategically, not wild, not messy, just enough to send messages. A man shorted him on a shipment. 3 weeks later, that man's car blew up in front of a market. No bodies, just fire. Just noise. A message written in smoke. After that, no one shorted him again. By 1975, he had his foot in the cocaine world. The leaf came from Peru and Bolivia, processed in jungle labs, sold in grams but measured in fortunes. And America? It couldn't get enough. Pablo partnered with a few older traffickers, men who had contacts in Miami. They taught him how to package, how to hide drugs in plane panels, in tires, in coffee shipments. He soaked up the game like a sponge. And then, like always, he took over. He didn't want to be a middleman. He wanted to own the sky. And he did. Within 5 years, he controlled his own labs, his own pilots, his own ports. The kid who once flipped cigarettes outside bus stops was now moving hundreds of kilos per flight. But the boy from Envigado, the skinny one who walked to school with holes in his shoes, he was still there, somewhere deep beneath the gold chains and polished pistols. And that boy was angry. Angry at the country that never gave him a chance. Angry at the rich who never looked down far enough to see him. Angry at the laws that were never made to protect people like him. So he didn't just want money. He wanted revenge. Not with bullets, not yet, but with power. With so much power that presidents had to smile in his presence, that banks had to bend, that history books had to include him, not as a thief, as a force. And that's how it all began. Not with a plan, not with a manifesto, but with a boy who couldn't stand being powerless, a country that made criminals more valuable than teachers, and a system that rewarded brutality over mercy. The perfect storm. And Pablo rode it all the way to the top. The jungle smelled like gasoline, hot, damp, and thick with the buzz of flies and ambition. Somewhere in the heart of Colombia, in a clearing carved from thick rainforest, 2 men stood over a table stained with coca paste. Their faces were tight with concentration, their sleeves rolled, their boots covered in mud. It was a scene repeated across dozens of makeshift labs hidden under canopies of green. But this one belonged to Pablo Escobar. It wasn't just drugs, it was empire in its first breath. The Medellín cartel didn't begin with a name, it began with necessity. Pablo had outgrown the street hustles, contraband, car theft, small-time smuggling. It wasn't enough anymore. Cocaine was the future, and he saw it clearer than anyone. Colombia had the perfect geography, remote jungles, long coastlines, weak institutions, and a hunger for fast money. Combine that with American demand, and you had a product that practically shipped itself, at least if you were willing to kill for it. Pablo wasn't just willing, he was ready. He needed allies. And in this world, that meant men who could handle pressure, kill without hesitation, and stay loyal, or at least loyal enough to fear him more than the police. Over the next few years, Pablo formed his inner circle, men who would become as infamous as he was, and just as dangerous. The Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio. From a wealthy family with land, cattle, and political connections. They brought respectability, the kind that fooled bankers and politicians. They were clean-cut, smooth-talking, and incredibly efficient. They didn't want to be in the front, they just wanted the cut. Carlos Later, a madman genius, German Colombian, obsessed with Hitler, obsessed with planes, obsessed with money. He had a manic energy and a vision of turning a private island in the Bahamas, Norman's Cay, into a cocaine paradise. Pablo needed roots. Carlos had them. Their partnership made smuggling global. José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, El Mexicano, violent, ruthless, merciless, the muscle behind the machine. He brought with him the paramilitary death squads and private armies that would later terrorize whole regions. Where others used bribes, El Mexicano used bullets. Gustavo Gaviria, Pablo's cousin, his right hand. If Pablo was the soul of the cartel, Gustavo was the brain, quiet, sharp, and loyal to the end. He handled logistics, finances, and connections, and always reminded Pablo when his rage got too loud. Together, they became more than criminals. They became the Medellín Cartel. Their organization wasn't a gang. It wasn't even a mafia. It was a machine. And like any machine, it had its departments. Production, jungle labs processing coca paste into high-purity cocaine. Each lab could produce hundreds of kilos per week, run like factories, protected by armed guards, often using child labor and coerced workers who couldn't leave alive. Transportation, airplanes, submarines, speedboats, trucks, even modified passenger vehicles. They had entire fleets. Pablo personally bought dozens of aircraft, each with pilots paid more than military generals. He used radar dodging techniques, GPS prototypes, and landing strips cut into the jungle. If the product had to fly, it flew. Distribution, Miami, New York, Los Angeles, Europe, even Asia. The Medellín Cartel didn't stop at borders. They worked with Cuban traffickers in Florida, Dominican street crews in the Bronx, and corrupt customs agents across dozens of countries. Finance, they laundered billions, used shell companies, real estate, casinos, offshore banks. Sometimes they didn't even bother laundering. They just buried the money. Literally. Pablo once said he lost over $2 billion to rats and mold. He laughed when he said it. Security. Assassins, bodyguards, paramilitaries. They weren't just protection. They were weapons of fear. These were the men who planted bombs, killed judges, slaughtered enemies, and sent messages with bodies left in public squares. At its height, the cartel was moving 15 tons of cocaine into the U.S. every day. That's not an exaggeration. That's verified. 15 tons daily. And the profits? Astronomical. They were bringing in $420 million per week, sometimes more. That's $22 billion a year in 1980s money. For comparison, at the time, only Fortune 500 companies and oil sheiks made that kind of cash. And yet, Pablo and his partners weren't issuing stock. They weren't answering to shareholders. They were answering to no one. Pablo became untouchable, not just feared, not just wealthy. Larger than life. He built an estate that looked like a dream someone hallucinated. Hacienda Nápoles, with its own airport, a zoo full of exotic animals, a bull ring, multiple swimming pools, and a dinosaur replica park for his children. He gave money to the poor, and they loved him for it. He killed police officers, and they feared him for it. He bought politicians, and they obeyed him for it. He became a paradox, a gangster with God status, a devil wrapped in charity, a father to some, a butcher to others. But with empire comes resistance. The DEA was watching. The Colombian government, embarrassed and powerless, was pretending to act. And the U.S. was slowly realizing that their war on drugs had an unbeatable enemy, a man who owned an entire nation's underworld. Yet Pablo didn't care. He doubled down. He started funding his own private army, thousands of men trained, armed, and loyal only to him. He gave them money, homes, women, status, and in return, they became his invisible wall, a barrier between him and the state. Police stations were bombed, judges were shot, journalists were disappeared, rival cartels were massacred. He even had politicians assassinated mid-campaign, on live television, just to send a message. I am not a businessman. I am a country now. The Medellín cartel didn't operate like a business. It operated like a government with no elections. And Pablo, he was the president of shadows. He made offers, set rules, enforced punishment. He decided who lived and who didn't. He shaped laws with terror, shaped minds with money, and shaped a generation with myths soaked in blood. And still, he believed he could go further. Not just as a kingpin, but as a real political leader. He bought his way into Congress in 1982. Clean suit, smile, public donations, cameras flashing. The newspapers called him a new voice of the people. Only later did they realize the monster they'd let in the front door. The Medellín cartel changed the world. They turned cocaine into a global crisis. They militarized the drug trade. They blurred the lines between criminal and politician. They showed that governments, if poor, corrupt, or desperate enough, could be owned. And it all started with a few labs in the jungle and a man who refused to be anything less than feared. 1985. The year Pablo Escobar reached the height of his power, and the year the entire country started to bleed because of it. By now, Escobar wasn't just a trafficker. He wasn't just a cartel boss. He was Colombia's most powerful man, even if his name never appeared on a government document. He had a seat in Congress, millions in offshore accounts, an army larger than the national police, and hundreds of routes feeding cocaine into the veins of America. He wore suits now, not cheap ones, hand-tailored, imported, his hair slicked back, his mustache trimmed clean. He knew how to stand in front of a camera and make people believe he was just a businessman who loved his country. He spoke softly in interviews, smiled when asked about politics, laughed when asked about violence, but behind the curtain, he was building something else, a war machine. The cocaine boom had turned Medellín into something unrecognizable. Once a city of factories and families, it was now a battleground between order and chaos. The poor were caught in the middle. The middle class pretended nothing was happening. And the rich? They built higher walls, hired more bodyguards, and prayed they weren't next. Every day, bodies were found on the roadside. Every night, a new house exploded. Every week, a new name was added to the list of the dead. And yet, through it all, Escobar remained distant, like a storm cloud that refused to rain on itself. He lived above it, beyond it, unreachable. But it wasn't just the streets he controlled. He had his hands deep inside the political system. He bought judges, senators, even generals. He funded campaigns for men who claimed to oppose him, just so he could later pull their strings. His philosophy was simple: bribe everyone, trust no one, and kill those who resist. He once offered the Colombian government to pay off the national debt in full if they would cancel the extradition treaty with the United States. They declined, and people started dying. This is where Escobar's madness grew teeth. The word extradition became his obsession. It haunted him. The idea of dying in a U.S. prison cell, far from his country, stripped of his dignity, it enraged him. He told his men that extradition was a fate worse than death, so he made sure that no one who supported it lived long. In 1984, Colombian Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot and killed, shot in traffic, his body riddled with bullets, his blood soaking the windshield of his car. He had spoken openly against Escobar, demanded he be stripped of his congressional seat, demanded justice. So Pablo silenced him. The assassination shocked the country. It was bold, open, a declaration. And it worked, for a while. Congress hesitated. Judges stalled. People were afraid. Escobar believed he had sent the right message, but he underestimated the response. The government, under U.S. pressure, launched an all-out offensive. Pablo's congressional immunity was stripped. His public image collapsed. The media, once paid to stay quiet, turned against him. And so, he disappeared, but not into hiding, into war. This was when Escobar shifted from a businessman to a warlord. He moved back into his stronghold at Hacienda Nápoles, a compound large enough to house an army, which it eventually did. There were barracks now, training grounds, armories, surveillance stations. He held meetings at night with men who had killed for him, bled for him, and were ready to die for him. He gave them orders calmly. They kill one of us. We kill two of them. And then he did worse. In November 1985, a Colombian guerrilla group called M19 stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá. They took dozens of hostages, including 11 Supreme Court justices. Their stated goal was political. But many believe Escobar had bankrolled the attack. Why? Because the court was about to rule on the constitutionality of the extradition treaty. And Pablo didn't leave rulings like that to chance. The military responded with overwhelming force. The building was shelled, Fires consumed the chambers. When it was over, more than 100 people were dead, including almost all the justices. Colombia watched, horrified. But Pablo wasn't horrified. He was pleased. The ruling was destroyed. The judges were gone. And for the moment, extradition was dead. Meanwhile, business continued. The cartel's planes still flew daily. Cocaine still flooded Miami and New York. Cash flowed back like rivers of poison, feeding the machine. The Americans were furious. They increased DEA presence, pressured the Colombian government with sanctions, demanded action. But even the Americans couldn't believe how big Escobar had become. They tapped phones, tracked shipments, followed dirty money, but every time they got close, someone tipped Pablo off. He was always a step ahead, always watching, always prepared. But power comes at a cost, and Pablo was starting to pay it. The first cost was paranoia. He no longer trusted his inner circle fully. He rotated bodyguards constantly, slept in different houses every night, refused to eat food that hadn't been prepared by his mother or wife. He built tunnels under his safe houses, escape routes, backup plans, shadow maps. Even his most loyal men began to feel the tension. "He doesn't smile like before," one of them said. "He doesn't sleep either." The second cost was blood. By the late 1980s, Pablo wasn't just killing enemies, he was killing civilians. Car bombs became his signature, loud, crude, spectacular. He targeted police stations, newspaper offices, judges' homes, even commercial flights. In 1989, he ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, believing a presidential candidate was on board. The man wasn't. But 107 innocent people died. The country was stunned. Even his supporters in the barrios began to whisper, maybe he's gone too far. And still, Escobar didn't stop. He couldn't. He was a man at his peak, too powerful to step down, too hated to surrender. The government intensified its efforts. The Americans increased funding and training. A new generation of police officers, angry and unbribed, entered the fight. Rival cartel, especially the Cali cartel, started turning on him, and through it all, Pablo kept fighting. He believed he could still win, that he could survive the world he had created. But beneath the gold, beneath the mansions and speeches and blood money, the cracks were forming. And when an empire starts to crack, it doesn't break slowly. It collapses all at once. Power never fades quietly. It shatters. And when it shatters, the noise is deafening. Loud enough to wake enemies who once slept in your shadow. Loud enough to draw new predators to your scent. By 1990, Pablo Escobar was still rich, still dangerous, still running the Medellín cartel. But for the first time in over a decade, he was losing control. It started like most falls do, with betrayal. Not from strangers, from people who once toasted with him, killed for him, hugged his children. His empire had grown too big, too many hands, too many mouths, and Pablo, obsessed with control, started questioning everyone. Paranoia dug into him like rust. He suspected his pilots, his accountants, even his cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, the man who had helped build the cartel from nothing. Then, in 1990, Gustavo was killed in a police raid, shot in Medellín. Escobar was devastated. But more than that, he was exposed. Gustavo had been the bridge between money and violence, the organizer, the calm hand behind the curtain. Without him, the operation became louder, sloppier, angrier. And Pablo, always a man of rage disguised in charm, let it consume him. The political climate was changing too. President Cesar Gaviria was no friend of Pablo's, and unlike his predecessors, he wasn't afraid to get dirty. With U.S. support, he launched a national crackdown on narco operations. Task forces were formed, intelligence units expanded. The DEA was practically running operations on Colombian soil. But Gaviria wasn't just fighting Escobar with cops. He used something more dangerous, hope. He offered amnesty to the drug lords, to their men. He promised, surrender, confess your crimes, serve light sentences, and keep some of your wealth. It worked. Dozens of mid-tier narcos turned themselves in. They handed over properties, drugs, weapons. In return, they got short sentences in special prisons, prisons that looked more like summer camps than punishment. Pablo watched as some of his own men flipped. He called them traitors, cowards, pigs. But deep inside, he knew something was shifting. The tide was turning. So he tried a move no one expected: surrender. But not like the others, on his own terms. In 1991, Pablo negotiated with the Colombian government. He would turn himself in, stop the violence, and serve a sentence, but only if he could design his own prison. A ridiculous request, right? But the government, exhausted and humiliated, said yes. And so, La Catedral was built. Not a prison, a palace. It had a bar, a pool table, a waterfall, a soccer field, and bedrooms that looked better than most hotels. Pablo handpicked the guards, controlled who entered, who left. There were no cameras, no searches, no laws. He surrendered, yes, but he remained in control. For a while it worked. The killings stopped, the streets cooled, Colombia exhaled, and inside La Catedral, Pablo lived like a king. He threw parties, smoked cigars, received visitors, ran what remained of his business by phone, even invited prostitutes and entertainers. His family visited often, his wife, his kids. They brought him new clothes, home-cooked meals, gossip from the outside world. He smiled more during those months than he had in years. But it couldn't last, because even from inside paradise, he couldn't stop being Pablo Escobar. Two of his former lieutenants, who had fled with millions, were lured back to La Catedral. Pablo accused them of stealing, of disrespect. The details are murky, but what's known is this: they never left. He had them tortured and killed, their bodies dismembered inside the prison walls. The guards heard it, smelled it, knew exactly what had happened. And that was the moment the government realized they had been played. They tried to move him, tried to transfer him to a real prison, a real cell, with real walls. Pablo found out, and before they arrived, he vanished. His escape was surgical. In the middle of the night, under heavy fog with a small team of loyalists, Escobar walked out of La Catedral through a tunnel built months earlier. No resistance, no gunfire. Just ghosts fading into the jungle. He was free again. But the world he returned to was no longer the same. While Pablo had played king in his mountain fortress, his enemies had evolved. The Cali cartel, long his rival, was growing fast, smarter, less flashy. They bought silence instead of headlines. Their leaders, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, preferred suits to blood, bribes to bombs. They watched Medellín collapse under Escobar's chaos and waited. Now they struck. And they didn't strike alone. Enter Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, an unofficial death squad made up of ex-cops, rival gangsters, former Escobar allies, financed in part by the Cali cartel. They had one mission: erase Pablo Escobar, not just kill him, erase everything he built. They started with his lawyers, then his accountants, then his couriers, then his family members. One by one, anyone tied to Pablo disappeared, shot, burned, beheaded. And for the first time since his rise, Pablo was on the run. He had no sanctuary now. Hacienda Nápoles was gone. La Catedral was a trap. His network was shredded. The police were hunting him. The DEA was closing in. And Los Pepes were executing anyone who might give him shelter. He moved constantly. Abandoned homes, farmhouses, tunnels, rooftops. He rarely slept in the same place 2 nights in a row. He rarely spoke on the same phone twice. He lost weight, grew paranoid. He no longer trusted his cooks, his drivers, even his own cousins. He stopped visiting his wife and children, not out of fear for himself, but because he knew they were targets now too. His calls to his son became shorter, his letters to his wife less frequent. He wrote in code, paranoid about wiretaps. He carried multiple pistols, often wore disguises, and spoke to mirrors when alone, practicing what he'd say to God in case it came soon, because he knew he was now a dying king. But Pablo was never built to surrender. He told his closest men that if capture was inevitable, he would take his own life. He said it so often, so plainly, that no one questioned it. "I'd rather die in Colombia," he said, "than rot in a cage in America." And when he said it, he meant it. By the end of 1993, his circle had shrunk to a skeleton crew. Just a few old soldiers, loyal out of love or fear or both. Blackie, Lamin, a couple of kids who didn't even know who Pablo had once been. They followed him through back alleys and swamps, through dirty mattresses and power outages, watching a man who once ruled a continent now eat from cans and sleep in basements. He was still rich, technically, still infamous, but he no longer ruled anything, just the last few days of his own story. And yet, even as he unraveled, even as the walls closed in, he never begged, not for deals, not for mercy, not for life. He kept moving, kept hiding, kept making calls. As if somewhere, deep in that twisted brain, he believed one more escape was still possible. But death was already on the rooftops. His hunters were in place, the police, the search block, DEA agents, Los Pepes lookouts, a city watching, one final call to his son, one final goodbye, one final rooftop, surrounded, gunfire, a bullet behind the ear, and the king who thought he could never die was left face down in the dirt. December 1st, 1993, his birthday. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria turned 44 that day. No candles, no cake, no champagne, just a narrow mattress on the floor, a crackling radio, and a body that was tired of running. The room he was staying in had no furniture, just a mattress, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a cracked window that let in the sound of the city he no longer ruled. He stood there, alone, looking out. Below him, Medellín breathed. Loud and restless, buses screeched, horns blared, children screamed in play. None of them knew that the most wanted man in the world was watching them from a second-story window in a quiet barrio. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, not from fear, from exhaustion. Limon, his last loyal bodyguard, entered the room carrying a plastic bag of empanadas and a bottle of orange soda. No words, just a tired nod. They sat and ate like two construction workers at the end of a shift. Heads down, no conversation. There wasn't much left to say. Pablo looked older now. He'd gained weight in the face but lost muscle. His skin had taken on that pale, doughy color men get when they live in hiding for too long. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours in weeks. He was dying before anyone pulled the trigger. And he knew it. That morning, he called his son. He wasn't supposed to. The DEA and Colombian intelligence had tapped everything. Every payphone, every cousin's line, every friend's number. Pablo knew this. But birthdays made men foolish, and he needed to hear Juan Pablo's voice. The call lasted a little over 6 minutes. He told his son to study hard, told him to look after his mother, told him he was proud of him, told him that he might not be able to call again for a while. Juan Pablo, 16 years old, asked him, "Papa, will I see you again?" Pablo didn't answer. Then, just before the line clicked off, he said something that would haunt his son for decades. "Don't let them lie about who I was. They'll try. But you know better." That call gave him away. The search block, a special police task force created just to hunt him, had been listening. They triangulated the signal, isolated the location, dispatched 2 squads. They moved quietly. Not fast, not yet. They had learned their lesson. Pablo was slippery. His houses were rigged. His men, even if few, were still killers. So they watched the house from a distance, waited for visual confirmation. Meanwhile, Pablo was still inside. He never knew they were coming. The next 24 hours passed slowly. Pablo read a newspaper from 3 days earlier, listened to the radio, dozed off on the floor, woke up sweating, checked the window, checked his gun, sat back down. Over and over. Routine had become ritual, a way to feel human while living like a hunted animal. Lamin never left his side. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't plan the future. They just waited. He didn't call his wife. He wanted to. God knows he wanted to. But he knew what it would cost. The authorities were following her every move. She was in hiding too, not from the law, but from Los Pepes, who had already made it clear that Pablo's family was fair game. They had burned down properties, shot up cars, and sent funeral wreaths to his mother's doorstep. Even for Colombia, it was personal now. That night, Pablo wrote something on a napkin. No one knows what it said. Limon said he folded it, tucked it into his jacket, and said nothing. Some believe it was a prayer. Others think it was a final message to his children. Whatever it was, it died with him. December the 2nd, 1993. A warm morning. The sun came up early and stayed hot, the kind of heat that made buildings sweat and dogs bark for no reason. Pablo woke early, checked the street from behind the curtain. Same buses, same fruit vendors, same stray dog that walked the same sidewalk every day. He thought about moving again. They had already switched hideouts 5 times in the last 2 weeks. This one felt exposed, too close to traffic, too many neighbors. But they were out of money, out of safe houses, out of friends. There was nowhere left to go. Around midday, he made the second mistake. He called his son again. Maybe he missed his voice, maybe he was saying goodbye, maybe he didn't care anymore. This call lasted over 5 minutes, enough for the search teams to zero in. This time, they moved fast. 4 unmarked cars, 2 sniper teams, a full perimeter, 1 radio channel. The objective is inside. As the unit closed in, the house grew quiet. Inside, Pablo sat by the window, holding the radio, flipping between stations. He heard something, not a knock, not footsteps, a shuffle on the roof. He stood up slowly. His body was slow. His instincts were fast. He grabbed the pistol from under his pillow, checked the clip, and yelled for Limon. No time for planning, just reaction. The police kicked in the front door. Gunfire echoed. The neighbors hit the ground, shouting, commands, screams, boots on tile, and Pablo ran, not out of fear, but out of pure muscle memory. He moved to the 2nd floor. Lehman followed, firing wildly. They reached the rooftop, flat, exposed, nowhere to go. Pablo returned fire. The police fired back. 1 bullet hit his leg. He dropped to a knee, gritted his teeth. Another grazed his shoulder. He crawled to the edge, looked down at the alley. Sirens, screams, the smell of smoke. And then came the final shot. Behind the ear, just like he said it would be. Was it suicide, or was it a sniper's bullet? Even today, no one knows for sure. But the image of Pablo Escobar, bloated, bloody, face down on a Medellín rooftop, became the final page in a story the world never stopped reading. The soldiers stood around his body in silence. For a moment, no one celebrated. They stared, some with awe, some with relief, some with hate. The monster was dead, but somehow he still didn't look beaten. The king was dead. December 2nd, RD3, 3:30 p.m. The rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín was still wet with blood. Escobar's body was cooling in the sun, his eyes wide open, his mustache stained red, his hand still clutching the pistol that hadn't saved him. Limon lay nearby, shot in the chest. The radio was still crackling, stuck between 2 stations, a strange, almost mocking sound. At first, no one moved. The search block officers just stood there, staring. They had imagined this moment for years, 1,000 different ways. Would it be in a mansion? In a jungle raid? In some glamorous gunfight with cameras rolling? But no. Pablo Escobar, the most powerful drug lord in history, had died like a cornered animal, face down in the dirt above a 2-story house with laundry hanging on the line. One officer lit a cigarette, another laughed under his breath, a third crossed himself and whispered, "It's finally over." But even then, it wasn't. They dragged the bodies downstairs. No finesse, no ceremony, just boots and blood bumping against the walls. Outside, the crowd was already forming, children first, then mothers, then old men with sandals and folded arms. They all knew. Somehow, they all knew. Word had spread like fire. They got him! They got El Patrón! The soldiers didn't care. They propped Pablo's body against the wall, pulled his head back, and posed. Flashbulbs went off. One officer raised a rifle in victory. Another gave a thumbs up, a trophy photo. Later, they claimed it was evidence. But everyone knew what it really was: revenge. For the officers Pablo had killed, for the judges, for the car bombs, for the country. Back at the police compound, they laid him out on a steel table. They stripped him, weighed him, tagged his toe. And then, one by one, officials and reporters came in to see the body. They didn't speak much, just stared, as if they were looking at a myth made flesh. This man had once offered to pay off Colombia's national debt. This man had once been a sitting congressman, a zoo owner, a folk hero. Now he was just meat on metal, bloated and empty. The news hit the airwaves within hours. Pablo Escobar is dead. Televisions in Bogotá flickered with breaking reports. Radio stations switched from music to headlines. Everywhere, banks, buses, barbershops, people stopped what they were doing and listened. Some clapped, some wept, some just stared blankly. Because even if you hated him, you couldn't ignore him. In the barrios of Medellín, there was no dancing. Not yet. People there had loved him, or at least loved what he gave them. He had fed them when the government forgot they existed, built homes when the state turned its back, paid for funerals, soccer fields, surgeries. And yes, he had killed. But to many, that just made him real. Not a saint, but their devil. Now their devil was gone. By nightfall, the city split into two moods: celebration and silence. In the police stations, they drank shots of aguardiente, cigars, toasts. In the high rises of the elite, they exhaled one less monster, one less threat. But in the slums, people wept. Candles were lit, prayers were whispered, not for justice, for memory. His mother refused to believe it at first. Hermilda Gaviria sat in a safe house surrounded by guards when the news broke. A soldier whispered in her ear, "It's confirmed." She didn't cry, didn't scream. She sat very still, her hand tightening around the rosary she never let go of. "God took him too soon," she said softly. "He was not done yet." His wife, Maria Victoria, heard about it while in hiding. She fell to her knees, cried until she vomited, not because of love, not entirely, but because she understood what it meant. They were no longer protected. The wolves were coming, the Cali cartel, Los Pepes, even the government. Pablo had been a shield, for better or worse. Now she had to run. That night, Medellín's underworld went insane. The moment Escobar died, his name lost its power, and in the void, everyone reached for what they could grab. Lieutenants turned on each other, safe houses were looted, warehouses burned, weapons caches raided. Old rivals made calls, settled debts, took territory, slit throats. In less than 6 hours, the Medellín cartel went from an empire to a smoldering pile of corpses and confusion. No chain of command, no central leader, no more fear of the name Pablo, only opportunity. Meanwhile, the Cali cartel celebrated privately, in expensive suits, with French whiskey, surrounded by advisors, accountants, and bodyguards. They didn't cheer, they didn't dance. They did what Escobar never could. They kept quiet. Their empire would grow in silence. From behind, clean desks and bribes too subtle to trace. The king was dead. The market was open. And Cali was ready to rule. In the early hours of December 3rd, Escobar's body was released to the family. He was placed in a simple wooden coffin. No gold, no silk, no military fanfare. Just wood and memory and the weight of history. They brought him to Jardín Montesacro, a cemetery tucked in the hills of Medellín. They expected a few dozen mourners. Instead, 25,000 people showed up. Men, women, children, old gangsters, mothers, priests, pickpockets, farmers. Some brought flowers, some brought candles, some brought stories. One man said, "He gave me money to start a shop." A woman said, "He bought my son's insulin." Another whispered, "He killed my brother, but I came anyway." Because that was Pablo, too big to hate, too cruel to love, too real to forget. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the rain came. Not heavy, just enough to make the dirt stick to their shoes. Enough to make everyone look up, as if God had come to watch. They buried him next to Gustavo, cousin, partner, brother in blood. The headstone was plain, just a name and 2 dates, no quote, no apology, no legend. That night, the city was quiet. No bombs, no gunfire, no speeches, just silence. And in that silence, a question began to form. What happens when the devil is gone, but the world stays the same? December 4th, 1993. The dirt on Pablo Escobar's grave was still fresh. Some stood in the rain that day because they wanted to honor him. Others came because they were afraid not to. A few came just to be sure the man was really dead. His face had been on their TVs for over a decade. For many Colombians, he wasn't just a name, he was an era. And the era was over. But for the people left behind, the ones who shared his blood, his empire, or his enemies, it was just beginning. His family was hunted. The government didn't kill them. But it didn't protect them either. Within 24 hours of Pablo's death, Los Pepes sent a message to Maria Victoria Henao, Pablo's widow. A wreath, blood-red roses, a bullet taped to the stem, no note. They didn't need to write anything. The message was clear. You're next. Maria Victoria packed bags in the dark. She moved with her son, Juan Pablo, and daughter Manuela from one safe house to another. The police offered limited protection, but it came with strings, media attention, interrogations, court requests. She wanted none of it. What she wanted was to disappear. But where do you go when your last name is Escobar? They tried to escape Colombia, first to Germany, then to Mozambique, then to Brazil. Doors kept closing. No country wanted the burden. No embassy wanted the scandal. Eventually, Argentina gave them asylum, quietly, unofficially. They changed their names, moved into a modest apartment in Buenos Aires, pretended to be nobody. Maria became Maria Isabel Santos Caballero. Juan Pablo became Sebastian Marroquin. Manuela stayed quiet, too young to carry the weight, too scarred to forget it. But even in exile, the name followed them. Reporters found them. Former allies came asking for money. Lawyers showed up with lawsuits. Governments demanded answers. Cartel enemies wanted blood. The children were never free, not truly. Every classroom whispered, every neighbor watched. Every friend eventually asked, "Is it true?" Meanwhile, back in Colombia, the government scrambled to rewrite the narrative. Pablo had been their shame, their national wound. Now that he was dead, they tried to clean the mess. They erased his image from textbooks, tore down murals, renamed streets. They banned the press from glorifying his name, banned the production of films or books that could romanticize his story. But history doesn't work that way. You can kill a man. You can't kill a memory. Tourists still came to Medellín, asking for Escobar's grave, posing with peace signs in front of his tomb, buying t-shirts with his face, taking tours through his old neighborhoods. A strange new industry was born, narco-tourism. The same city he once set on fire now cashed in on his ashes. And yet, there were some who didn't sell the story. They lived it. The victims, families of judges, wives of dead cops, mothers of children killed in his bombings. They didn't want Netflix shows. They didn't want plaques or apologies. They wanted space to mourn, to grieve without hearing strangers praise the man who destroyed their lives. They were never interviewed, never asked to speak on camera. Because their truth wasn't entertaining. It was just heavy, too heavy. And yet, the myth grew. Across the globe, Escobar became something more than human. He became a symbol of rebellion to some, of violence to others, of ambition, empire, chaos. He became a fantasy. In American rap lyrics, his name meant power. In TV shows, it meant intrigue. In streetwear brands, it meant style. In college dorm rooms, his face hung next to Bob Marley and Scarface, a narco saint, a drugstore messiah, a villain made of gold and blood. But the truth? The truth wasn't a movie. The truth was 4,000 people dead by his orders, a country traumatized, a generation of orphans and widows, entire cities living in fear of phone calls and shadows, judges buried without trials, police buried without names, schools evacuated because someone saw a package that might be a bomb. That was the legacy. not the luxury. And yet, there was something magnetic about him. Even his enemies admitted it. He was brutal, yes, but never boring. Terrifying, but unforgettable. Savage, but strategic. He could quote poets and kill you the same day. He could hug a child and blow up a senator. He could wear sneakers one day and a tailored suit the next. He was everything people feared and everything they secretly envied. And that's why he lingered. Years later, Pablo's son, Sebastian Marroquin, broke his silence. He wrote a book, toured schools, faced the children of his father's victims, apologized, not for his father's choices, but for the silence that followed them. He said, "I can't justify what he did, but I can try to prevent it from happening again." He refused to wear the name like a crown. Instead, he carried it like a curse. The Colombian government did its best to rebuild, but corruption stayed. So did poverty, so did violence. Different cartels rose. Different names filled the power vacuum. Different presidents gave the same promises. And in the barrios of Medellín, some children still said his name with a strange pride. Because when you're born into nothing, the man who gave you bread becomes a god, no matter how many bodies he stepped over to give it. The world tried to simplify him, put him in a box, good or bad, hero or monster, saint or devil. But Escobar was never that neat. He was contradiction itself. The boy who hated poverty so much, he created his own kingdom, then destroyed others who dared to enter it. The man who hated foreign influence so much, he brought a global war to his own doorstep. The father who loved his children so much, he orphaned thousands of others. He wasn't a story, he was a warning. They say that when a man gets everything he ever wanted, he either becomes a god, or he realizes how empty the world really is. Pablo Escobar never became a god. He just became a man who could no longer sleep. In the late years, during the slow, painful unraveling of his empire, Pablo spent more time alone than he ever had, even with guards stationed outside, even with a pistol under the pillow, even with millions buried underground. He didn't feel safe. The world outside was still afraid of him. But the world inside, that was what really kept him up at night. The quiet was the worst. In the early years, the noise was constant, planes landing, phones ringing, men laughing, guns firing, engines running. Noise meant control. Noise meant life. But by the time the 1990s came crashing through the door, the sound faded. Pablo would sit for hours in safe houses, listening to silence. No music, no chatter, no children's footsteps. Just that low, humming silence that came before a storm, or after one. And in those quiet rooms, a strange thing happened. He started remembering. He remembered the first time he stole a bike as a boy, how fast his heart beat, how alive he felt. He remembered selling cigarettes at the bus station, learning how to haggle, how to smile without trusting. He remembered his first pistol. The weight of it. The thrill of knowing he had power, even if no one else knew it yet. He remembered his mother's hands, how they trembled when he gave her his first legitimate paycheck, earned from illegitimate deals. She didn't ask where it came from, and he didn't tell her. In those nights of hiding, with the walls breathing around him and sleep refusing to come, he thought about every man he had ordered killed, not because he felt guilt, but because he couldn't remember all their names anymore. There were too many. Some deserved it, some didn't. Some were threats, some were just inconvenient. He told himself it was part of the business, that every kingdom needs a graveyard, but even kings have ghosts. And Pablo's ghosts sat at the table with him every night. He started dreaming again, too. The dreams were never about money, never about violence. They were small. His son kicking a ball in the backyard. His daughter feeding the hippos at Hacienda Nápoles. His wife laughing at a joke he couldn't quite remember. His cousin Gustavo alive again, smiling in the passenger seat of their first smuggling car. But the dreams never lasted. He'd wake up gasping, sometimes with his gun drawn, pointing at shadows, because he knew what everyone else was only starting to accept. He would never grow old. He'd told people for years, "I will die before they take me." It wasn't a threat, it was a schedule. Every day was borrowed, every breath stolen from a fate he could see clearer than anyone. He didn't drink much, didn't get high, didn't party like the younger traffickers. That's what people never understood. Pablo Escobar didn't enjoy being a narco. He needed to be. It was the only way he could live with the feeling that had followed him since boyhood. Insignificance. He needed to be more. He needed to be remembered. If he couldn't be loved, he'd be feared. If he couldn't be forgiven, he'd be immortalized. And he was. But it came at a cost. By the last year of his life, he no longer knew who to trust. Everyone had a price. And when your empire is burning, the rats run first. Men he raised turned on him. Informants, drivers, cousins. He changed phones daily, slept with the light on, carried cyanide pills in case capture came quicker than expected. His body was breaking down. He'd gained weight from stress, developed insomnia, his blood pressure spiked constantly. But he kept moving, because if he stopped, he might have to admit he was already dead. Even his love had changed. He still loved his wife, still adored his children, but the love was bitter now. He had given them a life built on danger. He had given them money, but no peace. They had everything, and nothing. He couldn't call often, couldn't risk seeing them. And every time he heard his son's voice, his heart cracked a little more. Juan Pablo once asked him, "Will they kill us too?" Pablo didn't answer, because he didn't know anymore. And the strangest part, despite everything, he still believed in his own myth. He truly believed the people loved him, that the barrios would protect him, that the poor would rise if the government tried to betray him, that his legacy would outlive the bullets. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. The poor did mourn him. The newspapers did remember him. The world did keep whispering his name, but what he never saw coming was this. The myth of Escobar would be bigger without him. In his final weeks, when the chase was closing in and the hiding places were running out, Pablo spent more time staring out of windows than planning. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being forgotten. That's what kept him alive all those years. Not money, not ego, not drugs. Legacy. But legacy doesn't come from what you build. It comes from what survives you. And in those quiet moments, Pablo started to realize he'd built an empire, but not a future. No one would continue the Medellín cartel. No one would carry his name proudly. No monument would be built. No child would be taught to follow in his footsteps. Even his own son changed his last name. And that broke him more than any bullet ever could. When he walked onto that final rooftop in Los Olivos, pistol in hand, blood in his mouth, he wasn't fighting to escape. He was walking toward the ending he'd always written, the one that came in smoke, the one that ended with a bang, the one where he was still in control. Because Pablo Escobar could let everything fall, his empire, his friends, his health, but he would never let the world watch him beg. In the end, he didn't die in a mansion. He didn't die in a war room. He died above a laundry line, on a rooftop, out of breath, out of luck, out of time. A man with everything and nothing. There's something that happens after a storm. The rain stops. The wind dies. The sky clears. And for a while, everything feels calm. But if you look closely at the broken branches, the cracked windows, the flooded soil, you realize something. The damage is permanent. That was Colombia after Pablo Escobar. He was dead, buried, officially declared neutralized. But no one celebrated for long, because while the man had died, his consequences did not. The Medellín cartel collapsed almost overnight. His death severed the last threads of loyalty, structure, and fear holding it together. Lieutenants went into hiding. Middlemen vanished or flipped. Warehouses were looted. Smuggling routes were burned or sold to rivals. It was over. But it didn't bring peace, because where Escobar once ruled alone, a dozen smaller devils rose up to fill the gap. The Cali cartel, long operating in shadows, emerged into full dominance. They didn't use bombs. They didn't kill judges. They paid them. They didn't threaten the government. They became the government. Bribery over brutality, suitcases instead of shotguns. They operated like a corporation. And for a time, it worked. But the Americans were watching now. The DEA had tasted blood, and they weren't about to let Colombia become a narco state again. One by one, the Cali bosses were captured or extradited. But by then, the game had changed. Cocaine was no longer just Colombian, it was global. Mexican cartels were rising, the supply chain stretched farther than ever, from Bolivia to Miami, from the jungles to European nightclubs, and all of them, in some way, were standing on Pablo's foundation. But Colombia? It was still bleeding. After Pablo's death, there was no healing ceremony, no national day of remembrance, no moment where the country stopped and said, "This is what we've become, this is what we've lost." Instead, it just moved on, quietly, numbly. Because what else could it do? For more than 2 decades, Escobar had infected every institution. Police stations, political parties, the courts, hospitals, airports, schools, even the churches. He wasn't a cancer, he was the bloodstream. You don't cure something like that with speeches. And then, something stranger happened. People started missing him. Not the killings, not the bombs, not the chaos, but the clarity. Because when Escobar ruled, everyone knew the rules. Cross him, you die. Stay loyal, you eat. Stay quiet, you survive. When he was gone, the new world felt confusing. 1,000 rules, 1,000 enemies, no clear lines. Some in the barrios began to whisper his name like a prayer. Some lit candles. Some named their children after him, even today. If you walk through the hills of Medellín, you'll find graffiti that reads, "Pablo vive," Pablo lives. But what does that mean? Does he really live? Not in flesh, not in breath, but in memory, in fear, in desire? Yes, he lives in the walls of the prison he built for himself. La Catedral still stands, quiet, overgrown, eerie. The soccer field faded, the bedroom stripped, but the bones of his madness still sit in the foundation. People go there to take photos. Tourists laugh. Locals look away. Because that place isn't just stone and history, it's a scar. He lives in pop culture, TV shows, movies, books, rap lyrics, fashion brands. People wear his face like a costume. Young men study his quotes as if he were a philosopher. Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the US. Everyone has a price. The trick is finding it. They think he was brilliant, bold, fearless, but they forget the funerals, the widows, the boys he sent to die at 15 for 500 pesos and a cheap pistol. They forget he was a murderer, not a mentor. He lives in the fear still baked into Colombian politics. Even today, politicians hesitate to speak too boldly about cartels, not because they fear another Pablo, but because they remember what happens when power goes unchecked. They remember the assassinations, the disappearances, the corruption so deep it felt normal. No one wants to go back. But no one really knows if they ever left. And yes, he lives in his bloodline. His son, Sebastian Marroquin, has made it his mission to rewrite the narrative. He travels the world speaking to youth, preaches nonviolence, tells the truth. He doesn't defend his father, he mourns him. He says, "Pablo Escobar was my father, but he is not my path." Still, no matter what name he uses, no matter what country he hides in, he can't outrun the face people see when they look at him. Because Pablo didn't just build an empire. He didn't just smuggle cocaine. He didn't just kill. He infected the world's imagination. To the poor, he was Robin Hood. To the elite, he was a monster. To the police, he was a nightmare. To the press, he was gold. To America, he was the devil they helped create. And to himself, he was a man who started with nothing and forced the world to say his name. But at what cost? He died alone, hunted, cornered, shot in the back like a thief. His children ran, his wife disappeared, his mother buried him in silence. And the people he built up? They vanished the second the money stopped. In the end, Pablo Escobar left behind 30 billion, most of which was never found. 4,000 confirmed murders. A broken country. A legend no one knows how to bury. He wanted to be remembered. He got his wish. But it came with a curse. Because now, no matter how far Colombia comes, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many lives are rebuilt, whenever the world hears that name, they don't think of beauty or culture or music. They think of one man, one mustache, one bomb. And that's the real tragedy. Not that Pablo Escobar lived like a king, but that he died as a symbol. And Colombia, his country, still hasn't been allowed to escape the shadow of his crown.